Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and I'm here today with another great episode of Kentucky History and another great Kentuckian. Joining us today is photographer Carol Peachee, who is an award-winning photographer. Carol has put together a wonderful photography book titled Shaker Made, which displays the wonderful Shaker Society, Pleasant Hill. She has also worked on numerous other projects, including urban and historical ruins, alongside the Bluegrass Trust for Historical Preservation. Carol, how are you doing?
I'm good, Jameson. How are you?
I'm doing good, and we again really appreciate you joining us. We're really, the Shaker community is a big historical spot in Mercer County and Kentucky.
Yes.
But there's a lot of interesting stuff to dive into.
Mm-hmm.
Before we do that, tell us a little about your Kentucky connection and a little bit about your background and that sort of stuff.
Well, I'm originally from Richmond, Virginia, but I have been in Kentucky since, first I was in the 1970s. And I did some graduate work at EKU, and then I came back to Kentucky in the 1990s, and I've been here ever since. Currently, I live in Lexington, but that's my connection.
Well, we won't hold the Virginian connection because Kentucky was part of Virginia.
I was going to say, Kentucky it used to be Virginia, so it's all the same, right?
Yeah, exactly. This book or photography book, and I want to make that clear, a lot of good work. I feel like you put into it. And before we get into the pictures and that sort of stuff, let's briefly talk about the Shakers and what that history is here in Kentucky. If you want to start with that, and we don't have to get too deep. We've talked about the Shakers before, but just an overview for those who are listening.
Right. Well, Becky Souls, who's the curator of Shaker Village at Pleasant Hill, she's probably the best one to speak to this, in terms of history. My history knowledge of the Shakers is not as in depth as hers, but I have been photographing Shaker Village since the 1970s when I did graduate work here at EKU. And the Shakers were a community that started in New England, came over from England. They were Mother Lee Ann was a Quaker, and she was the one that started the Shaker. And they were called the United Believers of a Second Coming, but they were called Shakers by the worldly because of how they danced in their worship practices, a lot of dancing and shaking and that sort of thing. So they came to Kentucky. That's a good thing for me to have forgotten, right? They came to Kentucky, I believe, in 1805. Is when the first missionaries came to Kentucky. I've got my little cheat book here. And, off and on, they grew to the point that they had about 2,000 folks come through. There were folks that were sort of true believers in the Shaker theology. And then there were those that came, like, for example, during the winter because it was cold, and the Shakers did not discriminate based on race or gender or anything like that. So they could get a meal, they could work. A lot of those also left. But Shaker Village went into decline in the early 1900s. Um, it was turned into Shaker Town. Lots of other folks around bought the buildings and that sort of thing, turned them into churches and this, that, and the other. And then in the 1960s, the restoration began. So it's from there on that the nonprofit that Shaker Village is now was established, and all the reconstruction and that sort of thing. So that's a little bit of a history, and not a very good one, but that's a little bit of a history of the Shaker Village,
Oh
right?
well, yeah, yeah, and that's perfect for those that are listening. It's really good to give that historical perspective. If for those who may not know as well, if you go to Mercer County, Shaker or Pleasant Hill is more the northern part of the county, um, and is a beautiful place. You can get, I mean, there's dining there. There's you can go visit, tour, all that kind of stuff. It's a great historical spot. Not to plug more of Harrodsburg and Mercer County, but just another
Right.
good historical place in that area to go check out if you're wanting to visit. Um,
And they've got excellent dining. You know, a lot of the food now is grown in their own in their own patch, in their own garden. So there's that too. It's beautiful, tastes good.
yeah, it's a
And
win-win.
it's historic, right?
Yeah, and don't forget to the Harrodsburg is having the 250th celebration coming in here in June, so be aware and ready to check that out too, because it'll be they're doing stuff soon. They got stuff going on for the next few months. So, um,
That's wonderful. Yeah.
um, what really got you inspired to do this book? I mean, you mentioned doing the grad work and being in the area, but what made you say, "Hey, I want to document this all in one medium
Right.
or so forth"?
Well, not to belabor too much about myself, but growing up in Richmond, Virginia, I was a stone's throw from Williamsburg. And back when I was a little girl in the 1960s, that was a real, it's not so much now, but back then it was a real cheap way for my parents to entertain us. Is we would drive down to Williamsburg. It wasn't as expensive nor as elaborate as it is now. And so the looking at historical buildings and trying to envision a historic people and how they might live was something I started at a very young age. So I was really ripe for when I came to Kentucky, and I discovered Pleasant Hill. It was almost like an echo or a throwback to, my early days. I've always had a huge interest in um, heritage sites,
Hmm.
photographing heritage sites. I photographed, old historic houses, industrial heritage in Kentucky. I did a book, Birth of Bourbon, through the University Press of Kentucky, which is on historic distilleries, um, heritage agriculture. I tried to show that through my book, Kentucky Barns. And so this was an attempt to sort of look at a community, a heritage community. Also, something very close and dear to my heart was sort of the way Pleasant Hill was laid out. And at the time in the 1970s, there were folks, doing the living history where they would make the brooms right there in the village, or make the boxes, or make the cider or whatever. So it dressed in period costumes, they would do the dances in period costumes and that sort of thing. So that was very, very fascinating to me, and it's just sort of fit with what I was interested in. How Pleasant Hill is laid out today is not with that living history, but more like a museum, and it's more closely curated, and the items are mostly more closely watched so they don't wander off, and also they don't get broken and damaged and that kind of stuff. So what interested me was just the heritage and the fact that Shaker Village really did have an echo of my childhood, experiences in Williamsburg and Jamestown and all the historic sites around where I grew up.
Yeah, and I see that as a continuous theme with a lot of people who are involved in some sort of history, um, the history field in
Yeah,
some sort of way. It's that childhood connection that kind of maybe it lingered on and then it blossomed out as when you get to an older age. But there's always that
Yep.
childhood connection that brings people back to why they're into history. Um,
Absolutely. And one of the most interesting things that I didn't get, like in just the historic stuff in Virginia when I was young, but that I found at Pleasant Hill was a combination of not just the historic architecture and this historic community, but their philosophy and their theology, where their attempt to do all their work, sort of in a spiritual vein, if you will. I mean, everything they made needed to be functional. That was important. But also the idea of working so that your craftsmanship might reflect the divine, that sort of spiritual ethos was really, really intriguing to me. And I really wanted to capture that photographically so that if I photograph, let's say, a shaker box, which there are millions of pictures of shaker boxes out there, I wanted to try, and and you all can be the judges of whether I've succeeded or not. But my approach was to try to have the photograph not just be of the shaker box, but somehow evoke some emotion that might hint at their spiritual ethos, their spiritual beliefs, which was something was beautiful because you didn't make something to make it beautiful
mhm.
because that was, fancy.
Yeah.
You made something in the spirit of for God, and making it for the divine is what made it beautiful.
Mhm.
So I was just very intrigued by that, combination of craftsmanship and spirituality.
Yeah, and to go with that too, it's pretty well known that the Shakers made very good quality stuff that lasted long.
Right.
Stood the test of time and so forth. And I think that's too when you title the Shaker made, it's divinely made. It is very good stuff. Um,
Right. Right.
um, and it's just a unique community history um, that we want to kind of touch on and go with and publicize. I want to promote it, go visit as well, but it's just a
Absolutely.
good part of history. Um, so we're gonna try something here. I'll let people know if you're watching on YouTube, then you're gonna get a little treat. Um,
Okay.
hopefully this goes smoothly. We're gonna look at some of these artwork, some of these photographs that Carol has been able to capture. I'm gonna plug the website as well. If you want to go check out all these, all you have to do is go to carolpeachee.com and website pops up. Um, um, go into the portfolio here and you can kind of see some of the different things. You mentioned this before, the cultural heritage, that kind of those sorts of things, and I might be lost on the. Um, is that it? Cultural heritage? Yes.
The
Oh,
cultural
yeah.
heritage,
There you go.
and if you click on that one, that'll open up some more.
There you go. Yeah. Here we are.
Should open up
Yeah. You,
more
you mentioned the barns, the mills,
barn mills,
and
copper.
just by glimpsing this, these are very good photographs. And some people,
Thank you.
they I don't know if what equipment you use or anything like that, but I know some people they get their iPhone and you can take some good pictures with iPhones and stuff. But these are very nice. um,
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yeah,
the bourbon one here, with the barrel on that, I mean. I think that could hang on someone's wall very easily.
that's a crowd favorite.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, but you get the section here for the Pleasant Hill Shakers, um, and again, some of the craftsmanship you can kind of already see when you start scrolling through. I'm going to scroll to one that I really want to talk about. Um, it's
Okay.
down here at the bottom, or down here, towards the bottom here, and it's the shoe.
Ah,
The
yes.
sa-
Makes you laugh. Right. Yeah.
uh-huh. um, and when you look at history, when I'm reading a book or just thinking about it or going to a place, I always kind of think of questions. What questions do you have? And if you ask a lot of questions, then that's when you can tell if you're getting into it. If you're really enjoying
Right.
this. So I have a lot of questions about this shoe. So,
Okay.
um, How old is it?
That's a very good question. I don't know that I know the answer to that. I would guess that, that's a man's
Hmm.
shoe, and it's a size 40 something, or the last has like, I think it has a 43
Okay.
um, tapped on the top of it.
Hmm.
And I would say 1800s,
Yeah.
late 1800s, but I'm guessing wildly
Yeah.
there. You know, there are several shoe lasts, male for men and women at Pleasant Hill. That was just one that I pulled out because I just love the curves in
Hmm.
it. But we'll say it's a couple hundred
Yeah.
years old.
That's a fair to say.
Yeah.
And what is it? Is it leather? Made out of leather?
No, this is made out of wood.
Uh-huh.
This is what the shoe was made over.
Okay.
So this is like a wooden mold,
Hmm.
and then the leather would have been hammered, and folded and crafted
Hmm.
around the last. And so some of the lasts that are there, and I'm not sure if any of them are in the book, but some of them are just they've been nailed in hammered nails in so many times, to create the shoes that they're rough. This one is smooth,
Hmm.
but they're rough from having nails put in them and pulled out. It's really fascinating.
Well, and that's one of the things that when I look at it, it looks so kind of worn. It's got good contrast. You got a little bit of
Yeah,
darkness. The black and white obviously does well too, but
right.
it looks so just old, I guess, to say it that way. And,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
when I think of Shakers, I instantly start thinking of dancing. That
yep,
because of the shaking, and at first glance, I was like,
yeah,
"Is that a clogging shoe?" Uh, But,
right?
those questions pop up like, what was this part of? What's this item's story? Um, but it's very good picture, and what is it? It contains a lot of information in just that one little bit. Um,
And to your point, Jameson, it's difficult, since a lot of the Shakers' expression of their spirituality, besides craftsmanship, was song and dance.
mhm,
How do you photograph a song and how do you photograph dance, of people who are not here anymore?
mhm,
And so I like the idea of the shoe as a way of sort of talking about dance.
yeah,
You know, that shoe's not dancing, but it's a way to sort of symbolize the
mhm,
dance. And in the trustees' house, there's the infamous spiral staircases, and to me, in a way, they seem to represent kind of music or the ascension of voice.
mhm,
So I also looked as I photographed for things that might represent more than just the material culture.
yeah, yes, yeah. Is that oh, that's a staircase? Is that the
Well,
front?
that's not. I
Oh,
don't
that's
think
not
that
the one.
on the website there is that image, but
Well, the next picture that I would want to talk about is this one right here. You know,
yes.
you think of Shakers, or at least when I think of Shakers, the dance is probably the first part. You think about the shaking and that sort of stuff. That's where they get their name. But then the work ethic, and you know,
Yes.
this would be the clothes that they would wear. Plain. Let's
Mhm,
get the modesty, those sorts of things that
mhm,
they kind of stand for. But this picture here, you got one side, you got the material that they would have made, and then what they would have wore. And first glance, there's nothing special that pops out of this attire. This looks very
right,
very normal, or well, maybe not normal, but very
right.
plain, modest. Um,
Yeah, and very typical for the times too. I would say that that also is 1800s, right?
mhm.
So that's very typical for the times. But it was simple. They wouldn't have done much fancy.
Yeah, yeah. Um, if you had a piece or a picture out of the entire shaker catalog that you have, what would have been your favorite?
Oh heavens. Um, that's a very good
Uh,
question. I mean, there is one image in the book Of course, I don't know if we've talked about if you have a picture of the book, but I just
Oh,
so
yeah.
happen there's the front of the
Hmm.
book. Uh, but there's a photograph that I took again trying to look at shoes, and there's a pair of women's silk shoes,
Hmm.
but they're black. They're very simple. They're very modest, but they're made of silk. And that was one of the industries at Pleasant Hill was silk, the making of silk. They had silk trees and silkworms and that sort of things. But anyway, um, there's two pairs of women's silk black shoes that I photographed at the base of a bench
Hmm.
in the meeting house, or where they would have had their dancing and singing, their spiritual meetings. And the light is coming in at such an angle that it implies, something a little more ethereal. uh, and I like that image because I like, the shoes on the ground, the light, you know, I like that.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorites. Some of the more dramatic ones, though, are of the spiral staircases.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, well, let me ask you this, and this is just more of a photography question because you are the first photographer I've had on the podcast, so yeah,
Okay.
that's a first. So when you go to these places, like most interactions I've had with photographers has probably been more like family photos and those sorts. But when you go to a place like lighting and all that kind of stuff, how do you know that this is a good shot? What do you look for? And that's probably a loaded question, but
Well, the first thing I'm going to look for is light.
Mhm,
But let me also say that any of the great artists like
mhm,
Michelangelo or any of them, they sketched before they actually took chisel to
mhm,
stone. And I think in photography, you have to be willing to take a lot of photos that just don't make it.
uh-huh,
I mean, even when I photographed with film back in the day, and we only had 36, there was a little bit more pressure to get it right. But you also felt like out of 36 images, if you got one or two, you were really doing well. Well, now you can take hundreds,
mhm,
right? And I do. So I might walk around and I might actually even use my iPhone before I work with the camera to take lots of sketches, so to speak.
mhm,
Lots of images, what about from this angle? What about from that angle? And what do I think of that? I look for geometry, design, triangles and squares and circles. I look for light, of course, because you can get a great picture of content, like here's the box.
mhm,
It's like, okay, that's a great picture of a box, but it doesn't really do anything for you. But if you have light coming in a window on that, it's going to make it completely different. So, what do I look for? I look for what is it I want to take an image of,
mhm.
but really then, how do I want to make it more than just a picture of a
Yeah,
box?
yeah,
If that's helpful.
yeah. Oh, yeah. That that sounds
And
great.
there are books and podcasts and there are all workshops. You can go to town trying to answer that very question, right?
Exactly.
It's a
Um,
good question.
yeah. Well, I'm gonna ask this question because I feel like when well, I'll preface this. My daughter is big into music, musicals, arts and humanities. We talk about it a lot, and one of the things we've talked about is mediums. So I came with this question. I thought, man, this makes me sound so smart. This question, but why why is photography a good medium to showcase the history of the Shakers at Pleasant Hill?
Well, I think, for people to visually see the material
Mhm,
culture, the bowls, the nails, the keys, the pegs, the chairs, the fabric, the rugs, the buildings, is um, to see it visually. I mean, a good author could, of course, describe it,
mhm,
but to see it visually, you actually see what it is.
mhm,
And so, I mean, but you want to see it in a way that's more than what it is,
mhm,
right? So I think photography I chose black and white. I mean, it can be very colorful, and I do all my images in color first, and then I turn them to black and white. So all those images I have in color, and they're perfectly good images. The black and white just sort of shows, I think, the structure better, and maybe you're not as distracted by the color. But we're a very visual culture right now. Everybody has an iPhone, everybody takes pictures, and we want to see as much as we possibly can. Um, and so photography can help you see it, but hopefully a good photograph will also help you feel it, even though it's paper.
Yeah.
Feel the wood or feel the texture, or go beyond just visual senses and use other senses as well. So I think photography can help you do that. And I think it's always interesting to see something that you can't imagine if it's from an era that we don't have anything like that in this era.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think it really goes to the history aspect of things. Whenever I read a lot of history books, but if I could
Mhm.
see
See a picture of it.
see a picture
Yeah.
of it, it just registers so much more. I'm here um, in Stanford in Lincoln County, and big to Kentucky history. We got a
Right.
picture of Benjamin Logan. They're rebuilding the fort, and now, like, when the fort, now that they're rebuilding the fort, it just gives you so much more of, okay, this is the what it would look like. And I've read Benjamin Logan's biography, but being able to walk into a field and see this fort on this
Right.
hill, it brings it to life, I guess. But like you
Right.
said, it hits all those senses.
Right. And there's something really interesting about being in a place where people used to be, but they're not anymore. Like, I always like to play a little with the idea of creating a sense of presence when what you really have is absence,
Mhm.
having absence and presence at the same time. And what a photograph does is kind of suggest a presence,
Mhm.
even though it's not there anymore, or the people aren't there, but this material thing is there and kind of represents all of that. And I also think it stimulates believe it or not, it stimulates your imagination, even though it's giving you,
Mhm.
a structural representation of it.
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, I do have a picture of the book.
Oh, there
There you go.
you
So, that is the cover of the book. Where could people get the book?
You can get the book wherever fine books are sold. You can get it on Amazon. I assume you can get it through Barnes and Noble. The University Press of Kentucky published it, so you can get it off their website. Um, Independent bookstores, a lot of independent bookstores have shown an interest in the book, so you can probably get it there. Anywhere that you can get your books,
Yeah,
they'll have it.
yeah. Which it shows me that's the spiral staircase right there.
Right, that is the spiral. Looking down,
Yeah,
I have some, showing it from the side, but yeah, looking down. Their craftsmanship is just amazing. I mean, you can look at that picture for a long,
yeah,
long time if you're looking at how it's made,
yeah.
and just see so many amazing things.
What is the style that this is? It used to have they were very popular, probably 20 years ago or 30 years ago. You would stare at it, and it would kind of it would slowly visualize something. Um, I don't know what that style is called, but when I look at this at first, it looks kind of like, man, what am I looking at? You kind of have to warp your mind around it a little bit, but it's very good.
Well, one of the other things I tried to do a little bit in this book with these photographs is other fine photographers have photographed Shaker Village at
Mhm,
Pleasant
mhm,
Hill. And I didn't want to just do the same thing everybody has done. So I tried to do a little bit more of a contemporary take on some of the images like that one.
mhm,
Of course, there's the iconic stuff like the upside down chair and the man's vest and hat.
mhm.
Those are kind of iconic Shaker, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's one of the Shaker boxes stacked up. But I did try on many occasions to, get a little bit more of a contemporary eye on on this beautiful historic stuff.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, Carol, the book is great. I think it really shows some great information, and it's not your typical history book. I mean, I would throw this as a history book, but it's not your typical history book that people get a hold of, and they have to read it for hours. I like holding a book and reading it, but sometimes my busy schedule, like everybody else, I need an audio book. Um, but but this is a different take, and I'm really glad that the University of Kentucky Press sent it to me and got let me check it out. It's just good. It's good to have a open eye or open a new eye to history. Um, so thank you for putting it together. First of all, um,
You're welcome. Thank you.
um, anything else that you would like to share before we wrap it up?
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
Yeah, yeah.
I could
Well,
go, as you can tell, I could go on and on.
yeah, yeah. No, well, and again, you got multiple works as well, other photography books out there, and again, I mean, you talk about you know, a book about barns and stuff, and people are, well, that doesn't really, what does that have to do with Kentucky history? But I mean, that fits right in. Kentucky's an agricultural state, and barns have been used for hundreds of years here in the state. What about
That's
covered bridges?
Well, I don't know if it's enough to get a whole book out of that. That might be a small project.
Yeah,
Some mills too. Again, not enough to get a book out of, but
yeah.
projects, and I put it in one of the books as a part of. But
Mhm,
that I learned so much about Kentucky history when I did the Barns book because
mhm,
traveling around, talking to people about their barn and when it was built, and I used a cutoff of 1970. All the barns that are in that book were 1970 or older. And so it goes all the way back to the 1700s. There's some barns in there, brick barns,
mhm,
log barns, stone barns, timber barns, etc. But in talking about that, you just learn so much about Kentucky history because Kentucky's agricultural or has
mhm,
been. So that was a really, really interesting project. It's not just barns, it really is. Here is Kentucky's history,
mhm.
shown through the land, and the barn is just an iconic structure to represent that. So, yeah.
Well, I'm just running. There's about 100 some ideas I could say. You should go take pictures of this and put it in a.
Well, if I can figure a theme where I wrap them all together,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. I thought about doing Kentucky, especially the old rural church buildings,
Oh, yeah,
because as you drive around in Kentucky, I mean, you can't not pass a pile of them,
yeah.
just bunches of them,
Oh,
and they're all so interesting. So that's
well,
one of those things that sits in the back of my head.
well, I'm gonna throw out the Presbyterian Church in Stanford, one of the oldest in the state. So
There you
if you ever
go.
get around to do it,
Yeah, I would love to. That's like I said, that's one of those things. I'd be out shooting barns and I would take some images of, a church or
Mhm,
two that I pass on the way out there, or, even doing the Shaker Village, the Shaker Maid book. I mean, there's the meeting house there, which was meeting house was a church, if you will, for the Shakers. And
mhm.
then when the Shakers were no longer there and people bought it, I think it was a Baptist church for a
Mhm.
while. It was
Wow.
converted to a Baptist church. I think it was Baptist. But there's several churches on the way, so it's just yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
Kentucky.
Well. Yeah. 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 Well, again, thank you for coming on and sharing your work with us. I encourage people to get out there, find it. There'll be a link in the description if you want to uh, purchase the book. I'm sure they'll send it to you wherever you are in the world. If you're in Kentucky, you can drop by a bookstore. I'm sure you can get it as well. But again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Jameson. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can. from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.